topic, but it's actually the same as the first. We're just extending a discussion of deductive argument as found in Chapter 12. In looking at this new topic, let's think a little bit about the terms that are introduced in the chapter and look at them more closely. We know about major premise. That's where deductive arguments begin. With an abstract statement, a rule, a belief, any of those things that might be related to the argument that it's based on. Validity, another term that comes up during the course of this chapter, has to do with whether the logic of the argument goes step to step in a logical fashion, whether it develops one step to the next. And that's what we explore in a little bit more detail. Plus, we also take a look at soundness of an argument, because sound arguments, really a subset, they have to be both valid and ones where we accept the premises. So there's a fewer number of sound arguments, and they have to contain valid statements in them. Why is this helpful? In part because when we're taking a look at any of these, from the Declaration of Independence to any other kind of argument, we want to be able to judge it and figure out what we agree with, what won't work. And that's what we take a look in this video, in the chapter. So in the chapter, there's a discussion of Edmund Meese. It comes up 2 times during the course of the chapter and in the summary statements. I make mention of it here because I think it's useful as an example to work with. Here's Ed Meese, who is unfortunately actually a U.S. Attorney General, who said this particular statement, and it's kind of unfortunate in the sense because it goes against some of the foundational pieces of our culture. But let's first consider it. The Supreme Court's Miranda ruling, he says, giving defendants the right to have a lawyer present during questioning, which most of us know about if we watch any kind of law TV or police drama, police procedural. Anyway, this Miranda warning, he says, is wrong and only helps guilty defendants. Suspects who are innocent of a crime should be able to have a lawyer present before police questioning. But the thing is, you don't have many suspects who are innocent of a crime. That's contradictory. If a person is innocent of a crime, then he's not a suspect. Okay. Well, let's untangle what he's saying here, and I'll put it in the order in which he kind of has it here if we're to take a look at this argument. Here's a couple of statements drawn from what Meese has said. Guilty suspects do not deserve lawyers. This is where he's really headed, though. It's the first part of what he says as an argument to try and reach this conclusion first. He sort of presumes a conclusion and then works his way toward it in an illogical fashion. Let's find out why. Guilty suspects do not deserve lawyers. If you were questioned by the police, you must be a guilty suspect. Therefore, those who are questioned by police don't deserve lawyers. This is what he's trying to argue. Let's go forward. If we take the statements themselves and unpack them, take a closer look at them, I'm going to rearrange them just a little bit so that we can take a look at the premises in a different order. One with which we'll have more familiarity because we'll recognize, I think, the problems with the premises and maybe with the validity of the argument right away. So I'm rearranging them. Here they are. If you were questioned by a police, you must be a guilty suspect. Guilty suspects do not deserve lawyers. Therefore, those who are questioned by police don't deserve lawyers. If we look at that premises, do we agree with it? It's usually innocent until proven guilty, and anyone questioned by the police, it doesn't make sense to us. Luckily, we can spot the logical problem with the premises, but let's just push it a little further. All right, now if we have these sentences that we've rearranged and not totally rewritten, but tried to condense so that we can make sense out of them, if we have someone who's questioned by the police, we can conclude that they must be a guilty suspect if we accept these premises, which we really don't. But we're taking a look at this. This is how the logic of the argument works. Therefore, you don't deserve a lawyer because guilty suspects don't deserve lawyers, according to Edwin Meese. It may be a valid argument if you look at all of those steps, but it's certainly unsound because we don't accept the premises. We don't accept that first premise. Maybe the second one, too. And so that presents a problem. Now, why would you explore something that's valid but unsound? In part because you want to see how an argument plays out. And in class, I'll talk in detail, say, about the Declaration of Independence and how at the time they wanted to see what played out if you assumed that all men were created equal. And they follow from that. And so you look in our book and it gives you the Declaration of Independence and it plays out the consequences with which if you accept the first premise, you go. And not everyone in the Americas and certainly nowhere else accepted those premises. In some places, they still don't accept those premises. And so my point being that we've determined that they're sound for us, that we work with them. We've even redefined them a little bit, but they're sound and valid for us. And that's why you'd make a distinction between having a valid argument and a sound argument. The sound arguments are obviously the ones that we prize, the ones that we have our culture based on. And that's why we're having a problem here, because we presume innocence until proven guilty. And that's what the Attorney General has argued against. So suffice to say, we're testing out the logic with validity, step, step, step. step following step. But the soundness of an argument has to be whether it's both valid and we accept the premises as true. Let's keep going. Here's another possibility. What if we have this? You do get a lawyer. Here you go, you're getting a lawyer. You must not be a guilty suspect. How does this one work for you? You do get a lawyer. You must not be a guilty suspect. According to the rule, if we accept the rule, and we don't, if we have a lawyer, which is not three, it's taking the third part and saying, no, not this, you must not be guilty, not one. It's as if, the evidence of the lawyer being by your side proves that you must not be guilty. And of course, that can't be true either, at least in soundness. But given the validity of this argument, we'd have to say that there's some validity to it, and that's why we say it's valid, but definitely unsound, because we still don't accept one or two. Okay. So that's kind of a weird situation. I'll come back to it here. It's an exception, maybe a surprising one, but we'll see if we can play it out and understand why it is. Let's first take another example. You're not questioned by police, so it's not true that you're questioned by police. We're taking number 3 and we're taking a look at it by starting with number 1 and saying this person isn't questioned by the police. Okay. Does that mean you do get a lawyer and you must be innocent? Is that what happens? Well, we call that invalid and unsound. Can you think of why that is? Can you think of why with the statement? I'll mark it here so that you can see a little bit more clearly what I'm pointing to. I'll make a nice color. You're not questioned by the police. We take this part. Ooh, that's a bad circle. And what we're doing is saying not one. Does it mean then we don't get 3? Not necessarily, and that's why it's invalid. And the reason is there isn't a rule created yet for if you're not questioned. It's a little bit like an example given in our book where it says, if it is Tuesday, it must be a weekday. Today is blank. Therefore, today is. And if you look through the chapter, you'll see it actually under discovery exercise, which we talked about in a campus class. But because we don't have a rule for it, at least not written on the page there, we can't actually go forward if it's any other day but Tuesday. That's in the example in our book. Now, we know that weekdays include Tuesdays, but the problem with deductive arguments is we have to have all the premises laid out in order for us to accept the definitions and for the argument to go forward. It's a little bit like computer language, and there I've just scared everyone away because people don't like thinking in computer language unless you're a programmer. You have to have the statement in order for the program to go. Okay, so let's keep going. Here's another one. If you were questioned by the police, you must be a guilty suspect. Guilty suspects do not deserve lawyers. Therefore, those who are questioned by police don't deserve lawyers. Then we get this statement. You don't deserve a lawyer. Can we take this one, which goes essentially backwards? We'll start here, and I'm drawing my circle so I can connect it to the 3 here. You don't deserve a lawyer. And go backwards. You must be a guilty suspect. Can we say that? Will that work for us? In this case, it's going to be invalid because we're affirming the consequent. We're saying the third one is true, and we can't go backwards. Because logic won't go backwards like this. You actually have to negate the third part, or the consequent, in order for the logic to work. Why? There may be cases, in fact, where if you didn't deserve a lawyer, you could be innocent or guilty. We're not really given another rule, and we have to have all our rules in place. It's called still invalid because it won't go backwards. There's only rare occasions when the logic can go backwards, and I'm showing that case to you. Invalid but unsound. That's what this one's called. The rule can only work backward if you negate the second part, or what's called the consequent. Okay, so we return to the one that does work, though it's a little strange, and it has to do with this one where you do get a lawyer. That's putting a big negative in front of 3. And you must not be a guilty suspect as a result. According to the rule, if you have a lawyer, you must not be guilty. This one works even though it's a little strange. It is still valid and still sound, even though with an unsound premise. What does it compare to? In order to understand this kind of weird situation that we have with this example, let's take a look at one from our book. This is on page 337, number 2C. So take out your book. Don't just try and look at the video to get it, because I want you to review this section of the book where it's a discovery exercise, and in campus classes we talk about all the examples, but 2C presents a special situation which allows us to take a look at this negation problem. The example given there are no sheep or creatures that sleep in beds. Should have a quotation mark after it, but there it is. It's that statement from number 2C, and there we have our sheep there. If we discover a creature sleeping in a bed, according to the rule, you go backwards, negate the consequent, and therefore this creature is not a sheep. Most of the time people will get this, even though it seems like a really crazy example. It's trying to posit a rule and seeing what follows, especially if you change the nature of the second part of the rule and see whether something else can be traced back to the beginning. For the sheep in the beds example, it seems so crazy that people will just laugh at it. But when we extend it to things like, say, the Declaration of Independence or some of the later premises, it really matters because we're testing out the logic, and that's the point. So bear with me for a minute. These examples seem really strange. This one will work. Going backwards works, and you can draw a sound and valid conclusion when you negate the second part. Now, let's take a look at a crazy example, just one that I thought up by using definitions. I find that sometimes you have to go really simple when working with this strange exception to the logic of deductive arguments. So I take a sentence that uses the definitions of beginning and end. If this is a beginning, I don't know what it's the beginning of the video, beginning of the class course, I don't know. If it's the beginning, this is not the end. It's not in the definition of beginning to be an end. Okay, so if we accept the premise, let's just try and go with definitions that are extremely abstract and they have to do with the definitions of terms. What if our beginning, for example, was a triangle and we said, if there's a triangle, then there's a red dot? I know we're getting very abstract indeed. If we take the second part of this and say, this is the end, we reverse it. So apologies to Jim Morrison and Doors fans. This is the end. Instead of a red dot, what we get, in fact, is a blue dot. Okay, we can go backwards in this one instance. It's not a red circle that we're getting. Therefore, it cannot be the beginning. There's no way with this rule that it can be a beginning, so we have to reverse it. Even if we get a triangle, we have to exit out almost immediately because there can be no triangle. It cannot be the case that we have a beginning if what we have is an end. They can't coexist. So because of the rule, a blue circle and then not red circle, uh, it cannot be green triangle because of the rule. That's how we set up the rule. If you set up a rule and it works, great. You can test it. You can even go backwards with it. There can be exceptions to it. But it's a little bit like studying that rule itself and seeing from all points of view how it will work. Going backwards in this circumstance works, and you can draw a sound and valid conclusion when you negate the second part of our rule. Valid and sound. Take a look now at number 12 on page 351. Now again, don't try to look at the video just without taking a look at the book because I'm trying to draw on the example from the book with which we talk a little bit more detail in campus class. So you have to kind of imagine it here because that particular example presents the challenge. If we have a statement that says if the two parties agree then there is no strike, let's see what will follow. Now most of the other examples that are similar to this at the end of the chapter quiz, that's the page 351 we're taking a look at. I'll get students who understand the other examples, but not this one. So let's look at it more closely and see what's there. There is a strike. What if we take that second part and say there is a strike? Reverse the no and take it right out. We go backwards, we're negating the consequent, the second part of the premise. Therefore, the two parties do not agree. We can do this, and that negates the antecedent, the first part. Okay, going backwards does work, and you can draw a sound and valid conclusion when you negate the second part. So let's go back to the Edmund Meese example and the business with the Attorney General and suspects and guiltiness and lawyers. That one example that we started all of this out with. If we were to apply it to a movie, and you can tell I'm making this during the holiday season, but if we took a movie like Kris Kringle, which isn't long, so when you get a chance you can go and review it. But if we take a look at Miracle on 34th Street, we could, take a look at Kris Kringle as a suspect. He's a character in that film. Okay. And we start with the premise Kris Kringle was a suspect in the movie Miracle on 34th Street. Therefore, Kris Kringle is guilty and doesn't deserve a lawyer. Doesn't really happen in the movie. But if we apply Ed Meese's logic, it would work and be valid, at least in this circumstance, because it follows the rule. In fact, it calls the rule into question. It has us test it out to see whether it's sound, which it isn't, as you can see here. We explore how that soundness of the rule works, and we realize that we can't prosecute poor old Kris Kringle. So going back to our definition, if a major premise is untrue and the deductive argument of the reasoning is invalid, the whole argument is said to be unsound. If the logical premises follow one right after another, in logical order, the argument is said to be valid. Let's get our definitions right. We should really add to this. that the validity of an argument can be tested if you go backwards by negating the second part or the consequent of an argument too, as we've explored in the video. All right. Why would this matter in the larger scheme of things with defendants, lawyers, suspects? I think it's pretty obvious that those things really do matter. I do try to use triangles and really simplistic statements to try and understand the bigger issues, but think of the premises that we studied in this unit and with this chapter. We have both in our book and with handouts examples of major premises that really needed the test applied to them to see whether we'd accept them as valid and as sound. So we take the Declaration, for example, or the Constitution. But the Declaration first, we declare these truths to be self-evident. The premise is laid out there. We have to test it out to see whether what follows is valid and logical. At the time it was posed, not everybody accepted it as sound. There are still places in the world where it isn't accepted as sound. And though I'll teach it in today's class, and my students in a campus class will be totally sleepy because they take it for granted. If they were transported somewhere else in the world where it wasn't the rule, we wouldn't take it for granted, that's for sure. The point of these rules, even though we do assume them and might not think about them from day-to-day examples, is that they are the product of our culture. They're the basis on which we have the foundations of our culture. And in testing them and examining how they work and when they are sound and valid, we're also defining the terms on which all of our people live. And that's the important part about this. We take a look, for example, in our book at Susan B. Anthony and how she updates the we from the Constitution to mean me, she says, and that women are people too. Of course they are. But it needs to be said, and people need to accept the premise. If they accept the premise, then they can see the valid and logical next steps. I teach in class the Gettysburg Address, and the highlight of that, of course, is to take a look and follow the definitions of the word dedicated. It's a short speech if you want to look it up. And the idea is that with each redefinition, and Honest Abe offers 4, he's not just talking about dedicating a memorial or a gravesite. He's talking about dedicating people and their purposes. And the dedication that follows is a deductive argument he would have his people accept during a time of war when it could have gone the other way or another way. During a great battlefield and just a horrible, bloody mess after Gettysburg. In spite of victory, they have bodies lying in the streets, and he needs to summon people and persuade them to be dedicated again. And he does. Or if we take a look at if we take a look at Martin Luther King, if we take a look at Martin Luther King, we can see that his premise, and he has several, but one of his premises has to do with an unjust law being no law at all, or in fact, a law that he says doesn't apply the same rules to the majority that it does to the minority, and vice versa. That it's not built along the lines of uplifting the human personality. So in their persuasions, they've really articulated in the premises the thing that they want people to notice, recognize, accept, and then to walk step by step through the valid steps of their argument. And there we have it. There's the exploration of deductive first premises and the valid reasons that might follow and the conclusion that might follow from them, and how to test them out, especially in cases when you're testing out the premise by negating the consequence.